Hi guys, and welcome to Anunnaki Sanctuary's channel. Tonight we step onto cool river mud that squishes softly under your sandals, and you can almost smell the wet clay as if it just came up from the banks of the Euphrates. A lamp flickers, a reed stylus waits, and the first human paperwork is about to happen, which is honestly the least romantic beginning to civilization. But here we are. Some parts of what you're about to hear are widely accepted history, the kind most historians agree on. Like how early Sumerian tablets often track grain, labor, and trade. Some parts are interpretation, where a careful reading might suggest extra meaning behind certain lines and lists. And some parts are calm, what-if imagination, where you let the night air and the temple smoke carry you into possibilities without treating them like proof. You probably won't survive this emotionally, because once you realize the oldest writing includes receipts, your soul takes minor damage. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your location and your local time, because I love picturing how far this little bedtime journey travels. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a low room where the walls are mud brick and the air holds that sweet, earthy scent that shows up right after rain. A scribe sits cross-legged nearby, calm as a cat in a sunbeam, and you watch him work with a reed stylus, pressing tiny wedge marks into a tablet that still looks like a snack-sized lump of dough. The motion is gentle but confident, as if his hand already knows the shape of the world. Most historians agree that the earliest Sumerian writing, what scholars often call proto-cuneiform and early cuneiform, grows out of practical needs. People want to count. They want to track barley, sheep, jars of oil, and the hours of labor owed to a temple or a household. You can almost hear the mental click of it, a society getting too complex to keep inside one person's memory. So it starts storing memory outside the skull, not in clouds, not in servers, but in clay that dries in the sun and becomes stubborn enough to outlast empire. You lean closer, and the tablet shows small impressions, some wedges, some little pictorial shapes. Even if you cannot read it, you can sense the mood. It is not poetry, not prophecy, not a dramatic confession. It is structured, repetitive, and weirdly comforting, like a grocery list that whispers, "Relax, the world is being managed." The scribe's tools are simple, reed and clay, yet the act feels huge. This is the moment when a river valley starts talking to the future. Archaeology suggests that places like Uruk become powerfully organized in the late 4th millennium BCE, with temples, workshops, storehouses, and administrators coordinating irrigation and labor. You picture the canal edges lined with reeds, water sliding along in patient silence. You picture fields of barley shimmering under a pale sky. These are the kinds of details that show up indirectly in the tablets, because the tablets keep tally of outputs and inputs, rations and deliveries. The evidence we do have points to a world where the temple economy is a major hub. Some tablets appear to record distributions of grain or beer rations. And yes, you let yourself smile at that, because humanity's earliest writing includes something that sounds like beer allocation, which makes you want to high-five the past and also maybe check your own budgeting habits. But then, in the same broad Sumerian tradition, you encounter something that does not feel like a ration list at all. You encounter the idea of rulers from an age before the age, a kind of deep preface that sits behind the earliest recorded kings. You do not find it as a neat, single tablet that says, "Here is the secret." It is messier than that. It comes through king lists compiled later, through myths and epics copied and recopied, through fragments that survive like driftwood. What's broadly accepted is that these texts mix different kinds of material, some of it closer to historical memory, some of it mythic and ideological, and that is where the bedtime-friendly mystery begins, the gentle kind where you keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You picture a scribe, not just writing receipts, but also copying older stories, the kind a temple might preserve as part of identity. One interpretation is that when later lists speak of kings who ruled impossibly long reigns, the point is not literal biography, but symbolic meaning. A careful reading might suggest the numbers function like mythic time, a way of saying, this was the deep beginning, beyond ordinary counting. It's possible that long reigns are a language of awe rather than a claim you can verify. That's a possibility, not a certainty. You let your eyes drift over the drying tablet in front of you, and you imagine a second tablet, older in spirit if not in actual clay, whispering that rulers existed before the rulers you can place on a timeline. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the rulers before recorded history are not a list of flesh and blood monarchs you could meet in a doorway, but a coded way to talk about power itself, about the rise of authority before writing catches up? The room around you hums with small sounds. A distant courtyard, a shuffle of sandals, a soft murmur of voices. Somewhere a goat complains about something deeply important to goats, probably personal. The scribe does not look up. He presses, lifts, turns the tablet slightly, presses again. The wedge marks accumulate like a patterned snowfall. Most historians agree that writing does not appear because people suddenly crave literature. It appears because administration needs a technology. Before writing, there are tokens and seals, and there is memory, and there are trusted witnesses. But as cities expand, the web of obligations expands too. Someone owes barley to someone else. Someone delivered wool. Someone worked on a canal. Someone is entitled to rations. The list gets long, and the human mind is excellent, but it is not infinite. Clay becomes the external hard drive, and yet, even in a room full of accountants, there is a kind of magic. You can feel it. A mark on clay stands for a thing, and the thing is not present, yet it becomes present in the mind. A sign stands for sheep, and a sheep appears in thought. A sign stands for barley, and you can practically taste dusty grain on your tongue. This is more than counting. This is representation. This is the mind learning to pin reality down in symbols. Historians still argue whether the first writing is primarily a straightforward response to economic complexity, or whether it is also tied to prestige and power. A way to formalize authority and create an official memory that favors the institutions doing the writing. You can feel the tension in that debate, because it matters. If writing begins as administration, then whoever controls administration controls what gets remembered. Whoever owns the tablets owns the story. You glance at a clay seal nearby, carved with a scene, maybe a figure standing before a deity, maybe animals in procession. Archaeology suggests seals are used to mark property, authenticate containers, and signal identity. To you, it looks like an early password. And just like modern passwords, it probably gets forgotten, misused, or borrowed by a cousin who swears he will return it and never does. Civilization, apparently, includes the eternal truth that someone will mishandle your login. Here is the mainstream anchor again, steady and simple. The earliest tablets we have from southern Mesopotamia are heavily focused on economic and administrative matters, and they come from major centers like Uruk. The evidence we do have points to a system where temples and large households manage resources. That is the solid ground. Now the interpretation, carefully labeled as interpretation. One interpretation is that even these dry records hint at social layers, because a rationalist implies hierarchy. Someone receives more, someone receives less. Someone allocates, someone is allocated. Even if the tablet does not say king, it may imply a world where authority is already shaping daily life. In that sense, the rulers before recorded history might not be a secret dynasty, but the quiet emergence of managers, priests, and elites whose names are not always written down. A more cautious explanation could be that bureaucracy itself is the shadow of power, and you can see the silhouette even when the crown is off stage. And now, the cinematic what if, clearly framed as a possibility. What if, in those earliest marks, there are not just numbers, but echoes? What if the scribes who learn to make wedge-shaped impressions also inherit older stories told by firelight? Stories about who first organized the fields, who first claimed the canals, who first said, "This land is under my protection," and who first convinced everyone else to agree. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You step outside for a moment, just in your mind, and the night air is cooler. You hear water moving, the steady sound of a river that does not care about anyone's dynasty. The moonlight turns the canal into a pale ribbon. In the distance, a temple platform rises, and on top of it, lamps glow like patient stars. Most historians agree that temples play a central role in early Mesopotamian urban life. They are not only religious centers, they are economic and social centers too. That means they are powerful. You walk toward that glow, and you think about the people who decide what gets written. Someone chooses which deliveries matter enough to record. Someone decides which names belong on a list. Someone sets the standard signs and teaches apprentices. Writing is not just a tool, it is a gate. If you do not learn it, you rely on those who did. That is the kind of subtle power that can feel more lasting than muscle. A popular rumor, told in modern retellings with a little extra drama, claims that some tablets hint at an era of rulers who are more than human, or at least more than ordinary. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it tends to circle around later mythic material and king lists, where the boundary between history and sacred storytelling is deliberately soft. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a mood rather than a claim. It becomes the feeling that a civilization remembers its beginnings as larger than life, because ordinary beginnings feel too small for what comes later. You return to the scribe's room. The tablet he is making is almost finished. He holds it up slightly, and you see the moisture shine. The wedges look crisp, like tiny bird tracks. You imagine how, once dry, it might be stored on a shelf, stacked among hundreds, maybe thousands, a library of daily life. And here, you notice something else, something small and strangely intimate. The scribe's reed stylus has a worn tip. It has been used enough that it has a personality, a preferred angle, a familiar pressure. This is not a mythical artifact. It is a tool of work, the kind of object that makes history feel human. Now you let your mind rest on a gentle interpretation again. One interpretation is that the earliest writing does not record the rulers before history directly, but it creates the conditions for later people to imagine them, formalize them, and claim them. Once a society can write lists, It can write lineages. Once it can write lineages, it can argue legitimacy. Once it can argue legitimacy, it can reach backward into the fog and name what the fog should contain. That does not mean it is a lie. It means it is an attempt to make continuity. Human beings love continuity. We love to believe there is a chain that links the present to the deep past, even if some links are symbolic rather than literal. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But it fits how cultures often behave. They stitch meaning into time. You feel the sleepiness creeping in now, not as boredom, but as a kind of warm acceptance. Clay, reed, counting, and quiet power. Not a clash of armies, not a monster roaring at the city gate, just the steady invention of memory. You imagine, very softly, a hidden prologue inside the ordinary. What if the rulers before recorded history are not hiding in a dramatic secret tablet, but in the very act of making tablets at all? The first person to standardize a sign, the first person to keep a storehouse ledger, the first person to decide who receives rations, the first person to seal a jar and make a claim. These are the invisible rulers, the ones who shape life without needing a throne in the story. And you hold that thought like a small warm stone in your palm. The damp scent of river clay, the scratch of reed on soft earth, the flicker of lamplight on wedge marks. You're not proving anything tonight. You're following clues. The solid ground is that Sumer's earliest tablets are practical records from early city life. The mist is the possibility that practicality itself is a mask, and behind it, the first outlines of rule are forming, quiet and enduring. Long before the world decides to call it history, you drift into a quieter chamber where the air feels drier, like sun-warmed dust resting on baked brick. The light is softer here, filtered through a woven screen that turns the room into a gentle honey color. On a low shelf, tablets sit in neat stacks, each one flat and humble, each one carrying the confidence of somebody who thought, yes, this matters enough to pin down. A scribe guides you with a small tilt of the head, the universal gesture for, come look at this. And he places a tablet in your hands that feels heavier than it should for its size. The clay is firm, the edges slightly chipped, the wedge marks clean like tiny cuts made by a careful hand. You do not read it like a fluent speaker, but you sense what it is trying to do. It is not counting sheep. It is counting time. Most historians agree that a text often called the Sumerian king list exists in multiple copies from later periods, and that it blends different kinds of material. Some entries align with rulers and cities that appear elsewhere in Mesopotamian records. Other parts feel mythic, grand, and deliberately distant. What's broadly accepted is that it is not a simple newspaper of the past. It is also a political and cultural document, one that shapes memory as much as it preserves it. Your thumb traces the edge of the tablet, and you picture how a list like this would feel to someone living in a city that wants to be important. A list tells you who came first. A list tells you who belongs. A list tells you that order exists. And if you are the city writing the list has a funny way of making your city look like the natural center of the universe. Civilization invents writing, and writing immediately invents the humble brag. You lean closer, and there it is. The detail that always makes modern eyes widen. The reign lengths. Some kings are said to rule for spans that are hard to fit inside ordinary human life. Not just a long reign, but an almost cosmic reign. Numbers that feel like they were designed to make your brain stop walking and just sit down. If you try to picture it literally, you end up with a king who outlives entire forests, watches generations turn over like pages, and still finds time to attend meetings. Honestly, the meeting part is the least believable. Here is where you keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is that the king list, as a literary tradition, contains extraordinary reign lengths for early rulers, especially in the portion that describes a remote era. The mist is what those numbers mean. One interpretation is that the reigns are not meant as straightforward biography. A careful reading might suggest the numbers are symbolic, a kind of mythic mathematics. They might express greatness, distance, sacredness, or the idea that early times were different in quality, not just quantity. In many cultures, the first era is described as taller, brighter, and longer. It is how the human mind paints origins. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But it fits a pattern scholars often notice across myth and history. You let the scribe show you something else. He taps a second tablet, and then a third, like a teacher pointing out a rhythm. Certain numbers appear again and again in structured ways. It's possible that scribes used numerical systems that make certain totals pleasing or meaningful, and that later copyists kept the structure even as details shifted. Mesopotamian math is famously sophisticated, often based on a sexagesimal system, and once a culture thinks comfortably in that language of numbers, it can build patterns that feel intentional. You do not need conspiracy to get structure. Sometimes structure is simply what a trained mind enjoys. Historians still argue whether the earliest part of the king list preserves distorted memories of real leaders and real transitions, or whether it is mainly a mythic framework designed to legitimize later dynasties by placing them inside a sacred timeline. Both possibilities can coexist, too, because human storytelling loves to braid threads that do not match perfectly. The scribe sets the king list tablet down and draws your attention to the act of listing itself. In a world where power often depends on tradition, lineage, and divine favor, a list can be a tool of authority. It says, "This is the sequence." And once you accept the sequence, you accept the logic that follows. If kingship moves from city to city in the list, it can imply that kingship is a single thing that travels, like a crown carried by the wind. That idea is not just narrative flair. It can be ideological. It can encourage people to see political shifts as part of a larger order, rather than as messy accidents. You feel the sleepiness in that thought, not as boredom, but as a gentle awe. People are not only building canals and temples, they are building frameworks for meaning. When a city can say, "Kingship belongs here now," it is not only claiming land, it is claiming the invisible right to rule. Now the mystery, carefully framed as theory. A fringe idea proposes that the impossible reign lengths might reflect an older way of counting that we do not fully understand, or that the numbers encode astronomical cycles, calendrical adjustments, or priestly knowledge that later readers take literally. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it shows up because the numbers feel so deliberate, so patterned, that people naturally wonder if they are more than exaggeration. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes an interesting puzzle. A puzzle can be soothing, because you are allowed to hold it without solving it. You imagine the scribes as guardians of patterns. Their world is full of repetition, seasons, flood cycles, market days, rituals. If a king list contains numbers that harmonize with a cycle, that harmony might matter more than literal years. A more cautious explanation could be that the reigns are a poetic way to say, these rulers belong to sacred time. Sacred time stretches. It can be long in a way that does not match a calendar. The scribe reaches for a reed stylus and makes a few marks on a fresh clay practice tablet. His hand moves with a calm that almost makes you sleepy on purpose. He sketches a few number signs, then pauses, then sketches again. Like he is showing you that numbers themselves are a kind of language. You watch the marks form, and you realize something quietly eerie. Once numbers are written, they stop being flexible. A spoken story can shrug and change. A written number sits there, stubborn and exact. Even if it is symbolic, it looks precise. That precision can be persuasive. You tilt your head and consider how that might shape the idea of rulers before recorded history. If a culture wants its beginnings to feel immense, it can write immense numbers. If it wants a boundary between ordinary time and origin time, it can make that boundary numeric. It is not that the scribes are lying. It is that they are composing. They are turning the deep past into a stage that feels worthy of the present. A small joke floats up in your mind because your brain wants relief. You think, if anyone today claimed they had been in office for 20,000 years, they would not be elected. They would be gently escorted to a very nice room with soft walls and a therapist. And yet in the ancient imagination, a reign that long can signal divinity, cosmic legitimacy, or simply the faraway nature of the first era. The scribe leads you down a narrow corridor. The walls are close, and the ceiling is low enough that you have to duck slightly, which is a nice reminder that ancient architecture does not care about your posture. The corridor feels like a throat-connecting rooms of knowledge. Your footsteps are soft on packed earth, and the sound echoes just enough to make you aware of your own presence. You pause, and the corridor becomes your cinematic what-if, the kind you hold gently. What if those enormous reign lengths are meant to feel like footsteps echoing in a hallway before the door opens? What if the list is guiding you emotionally, not scientifically, into the idea that there was a threshold? On one side, normal kings, normal reigns, normal politics. On the other side, the before time, where everything is larger, slower, and half-lit. You step into another room and notice a different kind of object. A cylinder seal, small enough to fit in your palm, carved with figures that look formal and mythic. Archaeology suggests cylinder seals are used to roll images onto clay, acting as signatures and symbols of authority. It's possible that seals and king lists share a similar function. Both stamp order onto the world. Both say, "This is official." If a seal is a signature, the king list is a signature stretched across centuries. Your mind wanders into a calm interpretation. One interpretation is that early lists help cities negotiate identity during periods of competition. City-states in Mesopotamia often rival each other for prestige, trade routes, and influence. A list that says kingship belonged to your city can be a political statement. It can be propaganda with a very tidy haircut. The haircut is the part where everything looks clean and inevitable. You lean toward the tablet again, noticing how the wedge marks vary slightly. The way handwriting varies today, that human detail matters. It suggests copying, training, tradition, error, correction. A text like the king list is not dropped from the sky intact. It is transmitted through hands. Sometimes a scribe misreads a sign. Sometimes a copyist improves something. Sometimes a local tradition gets folded in. That does not make it useless. It makes it human. Another small joke nudges in. You imagine a tired apprentice scribe late at night, eyes half closed, thinking, if I write a really big number, nobody will question it because it looks impressive. Then you imagine his teacher catching him and saying, no, make it a respectable cosmic number, not a sloppy cosmic number. Even in the ancient world, there is probably someone correcting your math. Now you let the mystery side breathe again, safely. A popular rumor claims that the earliest rulers in the list were not just kings, but something like intermediaries between gods and humans, or that they belonged to a special class of beings. This idea is tempting because it gives the distant past a crisp storyline. But the more cautious explanation could be simpler. It could be that later scribes wanted to emphasize the sacred origin of kingship, so they used extraordinary reigns to paint a mythic foundation. The extraordinary numbers might support the idea that kingship was seen as a divine institution, not merely a political arrangement. This is suggestive, not conclusive. You sit on a low bench, and the bench creaks in a way that feels like it is also getting sleepy. The room's quiet wraps around you. You think about how people today argue about history online with the intensity of gladiators. And then you realize ancient scribes were doing a calmer version of the same thing, just with more clay and fewer comment sections. Honestly, clay is an upgrade. You lift your gaze toward a small window opening. Night air slides in, carrying the faint smell of water, and reads, "Somewhere outside." A dog barks once, then decides it is too tired to be dramatic. The city continues. But in this room, time feels layered. The list tries to flatten time into a sequence, but your mind feels the depth underneath. Here is the mainstream anchor again. Steady. The Sumerian king list is a preserved textual tradition that mixes mythic and historical elements, and it serves to present a sequence of kings and dynasties tied to particular cities. That is widely accepted. Here is the interpretation, clearly labeled. One interpretation is that the impossible reigns function as symbolic time, making the earliest era sacred and distant, and reinforcing the idea that kingship has a divine or cosmic quality. Here is the calm "what if," clearly framed as possibility. What if the numbers are a kind of doorway code, not to unlock a hidden literal past, but to unlock the feeling of standing at the edge of memory? You're not proving anything tonight. You're following clues. And the clue is emotional as much as intellectual. The earliest rulers are described as too large for ordinary life because origins are always too large for ordinary language. The scribe takes the tablet back with care, as if it is both fragile and powerful. He places it among others, and the shelf looks like a silent city of its own, a city made of compressed stories. You feel your eyelids heavy, your thoughts slow, and you let the idea settle gently. The rulers before recorded history might be less like a hidden roster and more like a mythic horizon, a place where numbers stretch, names glow, and the hallway of time echoes with footsteps you can hear but never fully see. You find yourself outside, where the night air feels clean and cool against your face, and the city spreads low and wide like a sleeping animal. The ground is packed earth, smooth from countless feet. Somewhere nearby, water moves through a canal with a steady hush, and that sound starts to feel like the city's heartbeat. A few lamps glow in doorways, and their light turns drifting dust into tiny, floating sparks. Most historians agree that early Sumerian cities grow because farming and irrigation make it possible to feed dense populations, and because trade connects the river plain to distant resources. Archaeology suggests places like Uruk become unusually large for their time, with monumental building projects that hint at organized labor and leadership. Even if you never see a crown, you can feel coordination in the stone and brick, the way you can feel choreography in a dance even when you do not know the dancer's name. You walk along a canal edge lined with reeds that whisper when a breeze passes. The smell is a mix of mud, plant sap, and faint smoke from cooking fires. You pass people carrying baskets, moving with the calm efficiency of those who wake early and work hard. A donkey huffs in a stable, judging you quietly. You nod back as if you accept the judgment. This is a city where everyone is busy, and the busiest thing of all is the invisible system that tells people where to go and what to do. What's broadly accepted is that temples are central institutions in early Mesopotamian urban life. They are religious, yes, but also economic and administrative centers. Temples can organize labor, store surplus, and sponsor craft production. When you picture the first rulers before recorded history, you might imagine a solitary king on a throne. But a careful reading might suggest something more complex. Power could be distributed across temple administrators, elite households, and perhaps war leaders who rise during conflict. One interpretation is that early leadership is a network, not a single face. You turn toward the biggest shape in the distance, a stepped platform rising above the low roofs. It is not yet the towering ziggurat silhouette people often imagine from later eras, but it has the same feeling. It is a man-made mountain, built to make the human world touch the divine world. As you approach, the air changes. There is more incense, more baked clay, more polished stone, and more quiet seriousness. Like a library where everyone agreed to whisper, archaeology suggests that these monumental temple complexes reflect both belief and organization. You cannot build big without leadership. Someone has to plan, ration, assign, and motivate. Someone has to say, "We do it this way," and enough people have to accept it. So even if the earliest tablets are mostly rations and inventories, they imply a structure that can command effort. Historians still argue whether early Sumerian cities are governed primarily by temple elites who manage resources, or whether secular rulers already dominate political life. Using temples as part of legitimacy, it may not be one or the other in every place. It might shift over time. It might depend on crisis, harvest, and rivalry. That debate matters because it shapes how you imagine those shadowy rulers. Were they priests with ledgers, or war leaders with spears, or families who did both depending on the day? You step into a courtyard where a basin holds water reflecting the moon. The surface trembles when someone passes, and the reflected moon shivers too, like it is sleepy. A priest or attendant moves quietly, adjusting a lamp, making sure the flame does not die. Fire is small, but in a dark city it is everything. Most historians agree that Sumerian religion is woven into daily life, with gods associated with cities and temples. Each city has patron deities. And worship is not just personal devotion. It is civic identity. A careful reading might suggest that divine language in texts can reflect very human power relationships. If a city says, "Our God grants kingship," that statement supports the city's leaders. If a ruler says, "The God chose me," it supports the ruler. Religion and politics can be separate in theory, but in practice, they often share the same sandals. You notice carved imagery on a wall. Not a giant epic scene top of fur, but a formal tableau, a figure approaching a seated deity, offerings presented, order displayed. The message feels calm and firm. There is a right way to approach power. There is a correct sequence. Even the art looks like administration with a halo. Now the mystery, framed carefully. One interpretation is that when early texts describe gods as direct patrons or grantors of authority, they might be echoing real alliances between elites and temple institutions. That does not mean gods are fake in the ancient mind. It means belief and governance intertwine. A more cautious explanation could be that divine patronage language functions as a public script that helps hold society together. This is suggestive, not conclusive. You sit on a low step and let the night settle around you. A breeze carries the faint smell of barley beer, which is both charming and oddly relatable. You think, even 5,000 years ago, the city has its own nightlife, and it smells like fermentation and ambition. You look outward from the temple platform and see the city's layout, the clustered houses, the narrow streets, the darker patches where gardens might be. Beyond that, the fields fade into the night. The whole scene feels like a living diagram, and it makes you wonder about what is missing from the written record, because writing appears, but not everything is written. Names get recorded when they matter to institutions. Many people remain anonymous. So when you ask about rulers before recorded history, part of the answer is simple and slightly frustrating. Power may have existed in forms that did not leave clear names. A fringe idea proposes that the divine patrons in city traditions might preserve memory of a real elite class that arrived with specialized knowledge, and that later generations mythologized them into gods. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it shows up because origin stories often involve outsiders or culture heroes who bring order. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a gentle lens. It asks you to imagine how a society might transform social change into sacred narrative. You watch temple attendants move in slow patterns, and you notice how their routines create stability. Even if you cannot see a ruler, you can see rule. There are rules about purity, offerings, schedules. There are rules about who stands where. A city can be governed by law, ritual, and distribution systems long before you get a neat historical record saying, "This person was king." The evidence we do have points to complex administration, and complex administration implies leadership. You wander down from the temple area into a district where workshops hum softly, even at night. A potter's kiln radiates leftover warmth. A craftsman smooths a surface with practiced hands. Trade goods sit stacked, ready to move. Archaeology suggests that craft specialization grows in early cities, supported by surplus and organization. And here again, organization implies someone coordinating it, someone deciding priorities, someone controlling access to stored resources. A small joke slips in as your eyes trace rows of jars. You think, humanity invents civilization, and within minutes, someone invents inventory management, which is the true ancient monster. Not a dragon, not a demon, just the endless question of where you put the jars and who signed for them. You pause near a doorway where a family eats quietly. You do not intrude, but you catch the soft sound of conversation, the clink of a cup. A child laughs once, then hushes, then laughs again because children are basically tiny rebels with good marketing. In that moment, the city feels less like an abstract system and more like a web of ordinary lives, shaped by extraordinary institutions. Now you return to the core question in a fresh way. What do tablets hint about rulers before recorded history? In this city view, one interpretation is that the earliest rulers may be less about an individual king and more about the temple household itself, an institution that can command labor and distribute food. Another interpretation is that power may be shared between multiple elites, with a leading figure emerging only later as political competition intensifies. Both ideas can fit the evidence we do have, and both keep you on solid ground. But you also allow one calm "what if" carefully signposted. What if the temple lights are actually a map of who really ruled when nobody wrote it down? Not in the sense of a hidden conspiracy, but in the sense that architecture and routine reveal the shape of authority. What if the pattern of storerooms, the schedule of offerings, and the controlled flow of rations are the true fingerprints of leadership? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, because the names are often missing even when the structure is visible. You walk past a gate area where guards sit with spears resting across their knees. They look bored, which is comforting because it means nothing dramatic is happening. Bored guards are the dream. Most historians agree that city defense and conflict become significant factors in Mesopotamian history as city-states compete. If conflict matters, then war leadership matters too. A more cautious explanation could be that periods of threat elevate certain leaders, perhaps temporarily, perhaps permanently. And over time, that role becomes formalized as kingship. That is a possibility, not a certainty. Historians still argue whether the earliest political authority in Sumer is best understood as evolving gradually from temple administration, or whether kingship emerges early as a distinct institution tied to warfare and diplomacy. You can almost hear the scholarly voices in the background, calm but persistent, like two owls debating on a roof beam. You stop beside the canal again and look at the water's dark surface. It reflects a few stars and a slice of moon. The water keeps moving. The city keeps breathing. And in this gentle night, you understand something that feels both simple and strangely profound. Writing captures certain parts of life first. Often the parts that institutions care about. Power exists in that gap between what is lived and what is written. So you let the answer be layered and sleep-friendly. Most historians agree early, Sumerian urban growth and temple economies are well supported by archaeology and surviving texts. One interpretation is that those economic tablets hint at ruling structures without naming them, showing hierarchy through distribution and control. And what if, in the lamplight on mud brick and the hush of canals, the true early rulers are the systems themselves, guiding hands that shape a city long before a neat record gives them a clear name. You step into the open air again, and the sky feels lower, as if the night has leaned closer to listen. The wind is gentle, and it carries a faint scent of wet soil, even though the ground under your feet is dry. Somewhere beyond the city, the river moves with that steady, patient sound that can lull you half asleep if you let it. The canal beside you reflects the moon in broken pieces, like the moon got tired and decided to nap in fragments. Most historians agree that flood stories are widespread across ancient Mesopotamia, and that the landscape itself makes flooding a recurring reality. The evidence we do have points to rivers that can nourish fields one season and swallow homes the next. Archaeology suggests that some settlements show signs of flood layers in their stratigraphy, although the timing and extent vary by site. So the solid ground is this. People in the river plain have good reasons to talk about floods, because floods are part of their world. You walk along a levee where reed bundles are stacked like sleeping animals. A worker has tied them with fiber rope, and the knots look neat, practiced, and a little stubborn. The city has learned to live with water by shaping it, guiding it, and sometimes pleading with it. The river is both lifeline and threat. It is the kind of relationship that breeds stories. You slip into a low room where a storyteller sits near a small flame. The flame is not dramatic, just enough to warm hands and paint soft orange light on faces. People sit on mats, shoulders relaxed, eyes half-lidded in that listening state where the mind floats but still catches every important word. This is how memory travels when not everything is written. It moves mouth to ear, breath to breath. The story that rises in that room is familiar in outline. There is a great flood. There is a chosen survivor. There is a vessel. There is the sense that the world resets, washed clean and rearranged. What's broadly accepted is that flood motifs appear in multiple Mesopotamian traditions, and that later literary works preserve versions of them. The specifics shift, as stories do, but the emotional core stays steady. Water comes. Life changes. Memory tries to keep hold of what mattered. Now the question you carry tonight is about rulers before recorded history. and the flood line becomes a useful symbol. One interpretation is that flood narratives function like a boundary marker in cultural memory. It's possible that the story of a flood is a way of saying, everything before this is distant, different, and hard to pin down. A more cautious explanation could be that the flood is both a real hazard and a narrative device. Real floods happen, and also, floods make excellent storytelling hinges, because they explain why the past is fragmented. Historians still argue whether specific flood references in Sumerian and related texts reflect one singular catastrophic event remembered across generations, or whether they combine memories of many local floods into one grand, mythic flood. That debate matters because it changes how you interpret the early king lists and their dramatic timescales. If many floods are braided into one story, then the before-time rulers might represent a broad, hazy era rather than a set of individuals you could neatly chart. You wander out of the storyteller's room and look toward the river again. In the moonlight, the water looks peaceful, almost innocent. Rivers are very good at pretending. You crouch near the edge and watch the current carry small bits of plant matter downstream. The motion is hypnotic. You think about how a flood can erase not only houses and fields, but also records. Clay tablets can survive when fired, but in many cases they remain unfired, sun-dried and vulnerable. Water can soften them back toward mud. Even when tablets survive, they survive unevenly. The evidence we do have points to survival by chance as much as by intention. So here is a mainstream anchor that stays steady. Flooding is a real environmental factor in Mesopotamia, and flood stories are a real cultural factor in Mesopotamian literature that is broadly accepted. Now, the interpretation, gently labeled. One interpretation is that flood stories are a way to frame legitimacy. If a culture imagines a reset, then those who come after can claim a fresh start, a renewed kingship, a new order granted by the divine. A careful reading might suggest that some political traditions use flood boundaries to organize their past into before and after eras, even if the details are not historically precise. That's a possibility, not a certainty. You walk through a market lane where the stalls are quiet at night, but the smell of dried fish and grain still lingers. A stray cat watches you with the seriousness of a temple priest. You respect it. In your mind, you are watching how a city stores goods and stores stories. The flood story is not only about water, it is about storage. What survives? What gets carried? A fringe idea proposes that the flood line in some traditions might hide the memory of an earlier phase of settlement that is poorly visible archaeologically. Perhaps because rising water tables, shifting river courses, or later building activity cover or erase traces. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it can easily be stretched into wilder claims, so you hold it gently. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a reminder that archaeology sees through layers, not through time itself. Some layers are missing, some are disturbed, some are underwater. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You pause near a cluster of boats tied to posts. The boats are simple, reed and wood, rocking slightly. You imagine how a flood narrative might sound to someone who depends on boats for trade and survival. A boat is ordinary, and then suddenly it becomes sacred because it carries life through chaos. That transformation is the heart of myth, turning the everyday into a symbol. Now you let a calm, cinematic what if drift in. What if the flood boundary is a curtain you pull back to glimpse older names behind it? Not because you can prove those names, but because the human mind senses there is more behind the curtain than the record shows. What if the older rulers are not lost, but transformed into archetypes? Kings of an earlier world that feels taller and stranger. You walk to a small shrine near the riverbank where an offering bowl sits empty in the moonlight. Someone has placed a few reeds nearby, and they rustle softly. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion includes rituals meant to maintain order and appease divine forces. In a riverland, water is a divine force in practice, whether named as a god or not. So rituals around water make sense, and stories about water make sense too. You sit down and listen to the river. The sound is steady enough to be soothing, yet it carries a quiet warning. Water is consistent until it is not. You think about how rulers might respond to that reality. A leader who organizes levees, canal maintenance, and emergency response would be remembered. A leader who fails might be blamed, forgotten, or turned into a cautionary tale. Even without written chronicles, the community would remember who helped them survive and who did not. A more cautious explanation could be that some great ruler memories are really memories of competence in water management. If a person or an institution keeps the canals working, that is power. If they coordinate the labor to repair a breach, that is authority. So when tablets later speak of kingship as a sacred institution, it might reflect a deeper truth. In a riverland, leadership is inseparable from water control. Historians still argue whether early kingship is primarily ceremonial and religious, or primarily practical and managerial, or a blend that shifts depending on season and crisis. It is possible that flood events, big or small, accelerate changes in leadership structures. A city that survives repeated floods may centralize authority because coordination becomes essential. That is a possibility, not a certainty, but it is the kind of realistic pathway that fits human behavior. Now the story returns to the theme of rulers before recorded history, but in a new shape. Instead of imagining unknown kings with hidden crowns, you imagine unknown organizers with muddy hands. You imagine a leader standing on a levee at dawn, pointing where reeds should be placed, deciding which households supply labor, deciding which families receive extra grain because their homes were damaged. That person might never appear in a surviving tablet as a named king, but their impact could echo in stories and later legitimacy claims. A popular rumor claims that flood myths are coded history, preserving exact details of a specific ancient catastrophe that wiped out an entire civilization and forced survivors to restart. This idea is tempting because it feels clean. One event, one explanation, but let me rephrase that more carefully. The more cautious explanation could be that flood myths blend real experiences with symbolic storytelling, and that different communities adapt the story to their own geography and politics. This is suggestive, not conclusive. You stand and brush dust from your knees, then smile at yourself because you are technically brushing dust while standing in an ancient city, which feels like an interpretive dance about time. Your brain offers a small joke. You traveled thousands of years into the past and your main contribution is still adjusting your outfit. Humanity remains consistent. You walk back through the sleeping streets. A dog lifts its head, decides you are not interesting, and returns to sleep. The buildings feel close, protective. The moonlight is soft, and the river keeps moving, steady as breathing. You gather the layered answer in your mind. Most historians agree flood stories and flood realities are deeply rooted in Mesopotamian life. One interpretation is that flood narratives create a boundary in cultural memory that makes earlier rulers feel unreachable and mythic. And what if? In that boundary, the real hint is not a hidden list of names, but the idea that power begins in survival, in the ability to manage water, protect people, and restore order when the world turns to mud. You let that thought slow your breathing. The river's hush becomes a lullaby, not a warning. The city's lamps flicker like sleepy fireflies, and the rulers before recorded history, whoever they were, become silhouettes on a levee in moonlight. Not confirmed faces, but possible shapes, held gently in the mind the way you hold a dream without squeezing it. You wander toward the edge of the city where the smells change. Less smoke from cooking fires, more salt and damp plant life. The air feels cooler, and the breeze has that watery taste that makes you think of reed beds and wide marshes. The moon hangs low, and its reflection trembles in pools that lie between islands of mud. In the distance, something splashes softly, and you tell yourself it is probably a fish. Probably. Most historians agree that later Mesopotamian traditions speak of the Apkallu, a group often described as sage figures associated with wisdom, ritual knowledge, and the early ordering of civilization. The evidence we do have points to these beings appearing most clearly in texts and iconography from later periods, even when they are linked back to very ancient times in the stories. So the solid ground is that Apkallu traditions exist, and they are part of how Mesopotamians talk about the origins of the knowledge. You take a slow step into a marshy path where the mud tries to keep your sandal like it has attachment issues. The reeds are tall, and they whisper when you brush past, like the landscape is gossiping about you. Somewhere, a frog gives a single sleepy croak, then immediately regrets speaking up and goes silent again. Mood. Frog. Mood. You see a small shrine built on slightly higher ground. Just a platform of packed clay with a few offerings and a lamp. The lamp's flame is protected by a curved piece of pottery that blocks the wind, making the light steadier and warmer. You sit nearby and listen to the marsh. The sound is layered. Insects, distant water, a faint rustle of birds settling. It feels like the world is exhaling. Now you let the story of the Apkallu drift in, carefully. They are often described in mythic terms, sometimes with features that blur human and aquatic imagery. Some traditions describe them as coming from the sea, bringing wisdom to humanity. That does not mean the story is literal. One interpretation is that coming from the sea is a metaphor for knowledge arriving from outside, perhaps from distant regions connected by waterways and trade. A careful reading might suggest the sages represent imported expertise, specialized skills, or a class of ritual experts who claim ancient authority by linking themselves to a mythic origin. Historians still argue whether Apkallu traditions preserve faint echoes of real historical processes, like the spread of specialized knowledge and priestly systems, or whether they are primarily symbolic inventions used to frame human learning as divinely sanctioned. That debate is soothing in a way, because it reminds you that uncertainty is normal. You're allowed to hold a question without forcing it to become an answer. You watch the shrine lamp and notice how the flame's color shifts when the wind sneaks in. It gets brighter, then calmer, then brighter again, as if it is breathing. That flame becomes your anchor while you sort the layers. Here is the mainstream anchor. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian societies developed complex scribal and ritual traditions, and that later writings often project origins back into a mythic early era, framing knowledge as a gift connected to divine order. Now the interpretation, gently labeled. One interpretation is that the Apkallu are a story-shaped way to legitimize priestly and scholarly authority. If you can say, our knowledge comes from the earliest sages, then your rituals feel older, stronger, and harder to challenge. In a city where stability matters, ancient authority is a powerful tool. A more cautious explanation could be that these myths help communities explain why certain people hold specialized roles, like exorcists, astrologers, or high-ranking priests. The myth does not have to be literally true to be socially effective. You shift your weight, and the mud makes a small sucking sound that is both ridiculous and deeply ancient, because mud has been humiliating humans since the beginning of time. You consider how knowledge itself can be a form of rule. If someone knows the right ritual words, the right calendar, the right omens, they can shape decisions. They can advise kings. They can influence the public mood. They can say, "This is a favorable day." And suddenly, an entire city believes it. Now, the mystery part, carefully framed. A fringe idea proposes that the Apkallu might reflect memory of a distinct group of outsiders who arrived by water and introduced new technologies or social structures. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often gets exaggerated into claims of non-human visitors, which goes well beyond the evidence. Let me rephrase that more carefully. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the simplest version is that waterways connect people, and contact brings change. The marsh and river routes can bring traders, craftsmen, and new ideas. Over generations, outsiders can become mythic teachers in the imagination. You look across the marsh pools, and the moonlight turns them into scattered mirrors. What if teachers from the sea is a sleepy metaphor for outsiders arriving at dawn? Not sea monsters, not secret aliens, just boats gliding in with unfamiliar accents, new tools, and new customs. It's possible that local people, impressed and unsettled, turn that experience into a story that feels bigger than life. That's a possibility, not a certainty. You hear a distant chant from the city side, faint and rhythmic. It could be a late-night ritual or a group of workers singing as they finish a task. Either way, the sound is calming, like a slow metronome. You imagine a ritual specialist standing under a lamp, reciting words that are meant to keep chaos away. Mesopotamian rituals often aim to maintain order and repel misfortune. The evidence we do have points to a world where unseen forces are taken seriously, and where expertise in dealing with those forces is valued. This is where the idea of rulers before recorded history shifts again. Not just kings and not just administrators, but knowledge holders, people who can interpret signs, manage calendars, and claim access to ancient wisdom. Even if they do not wear crowns, they can steer choices. A city might obey the person who says, "The omens warn against it," just as surely as it obeys the person who says, "The law demands it." You walk to a low hut near the reeds where a small group sits around a bowl of water. The water's surface catches the lamplight, and it looks like liquid gold. Someone drops a pinch of something into it, maybe herbs, maybe salt. The gesture is slow and deliberate. You do not know the exact rite, and you do not pretend you do. But you understand the feeling, focus, care, and the desire to keep the world predictable. A popular rumor claims that the Apkallu were literal hybrid beings, part fish, part human, who ruled or advised the first kings. This idea is vivid and sticky, the kind of image your brain loves to replay at night. But to be clear, this is debated, and the more cautious explanation could be that fish imagery reflects symbolism. Fish are tied to water, and water is tied to life and mysterious depth. So fish-like qualities can represent wisdom from the deep, not biology. This is suggestive, not conclusive. You smile at the thought that humans have always been excellent at dressing concepts in costumes. Today we use logos and mascots. Back then, you might use a fish cloak. You sit on a reed mat offered by someone who looks half asleep but still polite. The mat smells like sun-dried plant fiber. You rest your hands on your knees and let the calm settle. You consider a simple fact that feels almost too modern. Knowledge can be centralized. Training can be controlled. Literacy can be limited. If only a small group can read and write, that group becomes essential. It can shape contracts, inheritances, temple records, and royal proclamations. It can decide which stories are copied and preserved. Historians still argue whether early literacy remains tightly restricted to elites for long periods, or whether it spreads more widely than we sometimes assume in certain contexts. Either way, the existence of a specialized scribal class is well supported. That class can function as a kind of ruling layer, not always visible to those outside it. You let a small joke float up, because your mind needs a soft landing. You think, imagine being the first person to invent writing, and everyone else immediately asks you to do their paperwork. Congratulations, you created civilization and also created unpaid overtime. Now you return to the ruler's question with a fresh development. Tablets often preserve administrative facts, but the stories around sages preserve a different kind of authority. One interpretation is that when texts tie wisdom to ancient sages, they are giving leadership a sacred backstory. Kings can claim they rule in harmony with ancient knowledge. Priests can claim their rituals are older than any dynasty. The whole society gets a sense that order is not improvised. It is inherited. And then, softly, you let the cinematic what-if settle in your mind. What if the first true rulers are the ones who define what counts as knowledge? What if they are the ones who teach the calendar, standardize the signs, and decide which rituals are correct in that case? Rulers before recorded history might include not only political leaders, but also the architects of meaning. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, because symbolic stories rarely name the ordinary humans behind them. You stand and look back toward the city lights. They flicker low on the horizon like a line of sleepy fireflies between you and them. The marsh spreads out, dark and reflective. You imagine boats moving quietly through channels, carrying goods and ideas. You imagine a traveler stepping onto firm ground with a bundle of tools and a head full of methods. You imagine locals watching, curious, cautious, maybe excited. Over time, that moment becomes a legend. The sages arrived. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian culture is shaped by interaction, trade, and shared traditions across regions. One interpretation is that Apkallu myths are a poetic way to talk about how knowledge travels and becomes authoritative. And what if, in the hush of reeds and moonlit water, the origin of rule is less about force and more about guidance, less about conquest and more about teaching people how to live together under a shared order? You let the marsh sound soften into a lullaby. The shrine lamp flickers once, then steadies. The night feels safe, and the sages, whether symbolic or faintly inspired by real strangers long ago, remain a calm silhouette of wisdom in the dark, hinting that the earliest power might have worn not a crown, but a teacher's patient, unhurried gaze. You walk back into the city through a narrow lane where the walls lean in close, as if the bricks are sleepy and trying to rest on each other. The air smells like baked clay and old smoke, with a faint sweetness from crushed dates somewhere nearby. A lamp hangs from a hook, and its light makes the ground look softer than it is. Your footsteps are quiet, and the whole place feels like it is trying not to wake itself up. Most historians agree that many of the earliest surviving Sumerian tablets are administrative records. The evidence we do have points to lists of rations, deliveries, labor assignments, and temple or household inventories. That may sound boring, but it is the boring stuff that runs the world. Even in modern life, the real magic is someone remembering to reorder paper towels. In ancient life, it is someone tracking barley. You reach a building that feels like a storehouse. The doorway is low, the interior cool. Inside, jars sit in rows, some sealed with clay stoppers, some marked with impressions that act like official stamps. You see bundles of reeds, sacks of grain, and stacks of goods that look like they are waiting for permission to exist. A scribe is seated on a mat with a tablet in front of him, and he does not look up. Because he is in the sacred trance of accounting, archaeology suggests that early urban centers depend on organized storage and redistribution. Surplus grain can feed workers who build walls and temples. Rations can support craft specialists who make tools and textiles. This kind of system does not happen by accident. It requires planning, enforcement, and trust, or at least compliance. So even when a tablet does not shout king, it whispers hierarchy. You watch the scribe press signs into clay, and you notice something subtle. Names appear. Not always, not for everyone, but enough to show that some individuals matter within the record. The names are like small lights, brief flashes of identity in an otherwise numerical world. A careful reading might suggest that the pattern of naming itself reveals status. Some people are named because their role is important. Others are anonymous because the system does not care to preserve their identity. Historians still argue whether these administrative tablets primarily reflect temple-based economies, or whether they also reflect powerful private households and early political authorities using similar record-keeping systems. It is possible that temple and palace functions overlap in early phases, and that later categories are being projected backward. That is a possibility, not a certainty, but it is a common caution in how scholars interpret early evidence. You drift deeper into the storehouse and see a rack of tablets drying. Some are small and thick, others wider and flatter. Their surfaces are crowded with marks. The clay has that matte look of something that once was soft. You imagine the hands that made them, the patience required, the discipline of learning signs. Literacy is labor. It takes time, and time means investment. Investment means someone decided it was worth it. Now you let the question shift into a new development. Instead of asking, "Who are the rulers?" you ask, "How does power appear when it is hiding in plain sight?" Because that is what these records can do. They show you the machinery. Most historians agree that redistribution systems involve allocations. Some people receive more, some less. You look at a tablet that appears to list rations, and you imagine the human reality behind it. A worker receives a standard measure. A supervisor receives more. A specialist receives a different kind of allotment. A careful reading might suggest that these differences reflect rank and control. A more cautious explanation could be that rations vary with job type, season, and age. But even so, variation implies categorization. Categorization implies authority. A small joke drifts into your mind, because your brain cannot resist. You think, ancient civilization is basically one enormous group project, and the tablets are the part where everyone argues about who did the most work. The difference is that in Sumer, the group project comes with barley rations, which honestly sounds more motivating than modern participation grades. You step out into a courtyard connected to the storehouse. It is quiet, but you can feel the presence of management. There is a guard near a gate, watching without drama. There is an attendant who checks seals on jars. There is a person who carries a tablet from one room to another like it is a passport. The whole place runs on permissions. Here is the mainstream anchor again. Earlier Sumerian record-keeping is strongly connected to economic management and the distribution of resources, and it is one of the clearest documented windows into how early institutions function. Now the interpretation, clearly labeled. One interpretation is that bureaucracy itself hints at rulers before crowns are visible in the record. The ruler might be the institution, the temple household, or a leading family whose power is expressed through control of storage, labor, and written accounting. The tablet is not a story about a king. It is a story about who gets fed, who works, and who decides. Now the mystery, framed safely. A fringe idea proposes that some early administrative systems might be intentionally opaque, designed so ordinary people cannot easily challenge them because the record keepers hold the keys to interpretation. This theory isn't widely accepted as a grand scheme, and it does not need to be a conspiracy to be true in a limited way. If only trained scribes can read the tablets, then the meaning of a tablet can be controlled by those scribes. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a simple observation. Specialized knowledge creates power imbalances. You watch a scribe read aloud to an administrator, and you notice the dynamic. The administrator listens, then nods, then gestures. The scribe is the channel. The administrator is the decision, but you also sense something interesting. The scribe could, in theory, influence what is emphasized and what is minimized. Even today, whoever summarizes the data can shape the meeting. The ancient version is the same, just with clay and less coffee. You walk to another room where tools are stored. Not fancy weapons, just everyday tools. Sickles, baskets, ropes. The tools smell like use. You imagine the labor behind them. Canals dug, fields planted, walls repaired. All of that labor becomes legible only when someone records it. The record does not capture sweat. It captures obligations. Historians still argue whether the earliest forms of political authority emerged from control of irrigation and land, or from trade and warfare, or from ritual leadership, or from all of these braided together. The tablets show you the threads, but not always the knot where they tie. You pick up a small clay ceiling impression, a lump with a rolled image on it. The image shows a formal scene, maybe a figure in authority receiving others. You do not claim a precise reading, but you feel the intention. The seal says, "This is official." It says, "Someone has the right to approve." A seal is like an ancient signature, and signatures are little flags of power. A careful reading might suggest that seals reveal social hierarchy, even when the tablet content is purely economic. If a certain seal appears often, that person or office may be important. If certain motifs appear in elite contexts, they might reflect ideology. The evidence we do have points to seals as both practical tools and status symbols. You step into the night again and breathe in. The air feels cooler, and the sky is sprinkled with stars. Somewhere, a distant flute plays a few notes, then stops, as if the musician remembered it is bedtime. You walk through a residential area where the houses are small, and you think about the gap between the people living here and the storehouse system. Most people probably experience power as a schedule, a ration, a rule. They do not need to know the ruler's face to feel the ruler's hand. Now you let yourself imagine a calm what-if, carefully marked as possibility. What if the tally marks are secret fingerprints of rulers before crowns, not in the sense of a hidden cabal, but in the sense that numbers reveal who controls distribution? If you map who receives the largest allocations, who authorizes deliveries, whose seal appears most, you begin to see the outline of leadership. A popular rumor claims that certain tablets contain coded references to a hidden dynasty, a line of rulers deliberately erased from public memory. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for deliberate erasure is usually thin. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is possible that later political changes lead to selective preservation and selective copying. Some documents survive because they were stored well. Some disappear because they were not. Some narratives are favored because they flatter the present. That does not require a secret plot. It requires ordinary human bias and the simple fact that time destroys things unevenly. Historians still argue whether gaps in the early record are mostly accidental, due to preservation and excavation chance, or whether some gaps reflect purposeful choices about what texts were worth copying. Both can be true. People can favor certain stories, and time can still do most of the erasing. You return to a small square where a water jar sits under a roofed stand. You scoop a little water in your hands and let it cool your fingers. Water, grain, labor, records, the building blocks of early city life. And power is there, not always dramatic, but persistent. You settle into the answer with a new clarity. Most historians agree that administrative tablets reveal systems of redistribution, labor organization, and institutional management in early Sumer. One interpretation is that these systems hint at rulers before the clear royal narratives, showing hierarchy through who controls resources and writing. And what if, in the quiet rustle of drying clay and the soft thud of a reed stylus, the earliest rulers are not hidden behind a curtain, but sitting at a low table, calmly deciding what gets counted and who gets fed. You let your breathing slow to match the city's sleep. The lamps dim, the storehouse doors are closed, the tablets rest in stacks like sleeping birds, and the hint the tablets offer is gentle but firm. Power leaves marks, even when it does not leave a name. You step onto a flat rooftop where the city feels quieter, like all the noise has sunk into the mud brick and decided to sleep. The roof is cool under your feet, and a light breeze slides past your ears. Above you, the sky is wide and dark, crowded with stars. They look sharp tonight, not blurry, as if the universe decided to put on glasses. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamians pay close attention to the sky, and that over time they developed systematic ways of observing celestial movements. The evidence we do have points to lists of stars, calendar calculations, and omen traditions that connect celestial events to earthly outcomes. Even if not all of these practices begin in the earliest Sumerian phase, the roots of sky-focused thinking are deeply embedded in the region's intellectual and religious life. You lie back on the roof, hands behind your head, and let the stars do what they do best, make your problems look tiny and also somehow more poetic. A temple attendant nearby adjusts a small lamp so it does not cast too much light upward. The darkness is part of the observation. You cannot read the sky well if you flood it with your own glow. That feels like a life lesson, honestly. A careful reading might suggest that the calendar is one of the earliest tools of rule. If you decide when festivals happen, when taxes are due, when labor is summoned, when offerings are made, then you are not just tracking time, you are shaping it. The more cautious explanation could be that early calendars begin as practical schedules for agriculture and ritual. But once a schedule is shared, it becomes a framework for obedience. People show up when the calendar says. People plant when the calendar says. People fear the wrong day because the calendar says. Historians still argue whether the authority of sky observation emerges primarily from genuine attempts to understand and predict seasonal patterns, or from the social power gained by those who claim to interpret celestial signs. It may be both. A person can be sincere and influential at the same time. That happens all the time, even now, when someone starts a trend online and swears they are just sharing their journey. You sit up and focus on a cluster of stars near the horizon. The air smells faintly of smoke and cool clay. Somewhere below, a baby cries once, then settles. A dog sighs. The city is alive, but barely, like it is running on low battery. Most historians agree that omen traditions become a major feature of Mesopotamian scholarly culture, especially in later periods, and that the interpretation of signs is tied to temple and royal institutions. The evidence we do have points to a worldview where the gods can communicate through unusual events, eclipses, storms, strange animal births, patterns in smoke, and yes, the behavior of the stars. That does not mean every omen is real in a modern scientific sense. It means the social belief in omens is real, and that belief affects decisions. Now the ruler's question takes on a new shape. If someone can claim to read messages from the sky, that person can influence rulers or even function as a ruler in practice. A careful reading might suggest that control of prediction means control of people. If you can say, "The heavens warn against this," you can slow a war, delay a project, or redirect resources. If you can say, "The sign is favorable," you can encourage action and rally morale. Even if you do not give orders, you can bend the direction of those who do. A small joke rises up, because your mind wants to stay gentle. You think, imagine being the person who has to announce an eclipse. Half the city is panicking, and you are like, no, it is just the sky doing its thing. But also, yes, it might mean your boss should postpone the meeting. Honestly, postponing meetings might be the true divine gift. You watch a scholar, or maybe a priest trained in observation, mark something on a small tablet by lamplight. The marks are careful. The act feels precise, like he is trying to pin the sky down with the same confidence as a rationalist. It is a strange thought. The same writing system that counts barley can also count stars. The same clay that records labor can record wonder. Here is the mainstream anchor. Mesopotamian societies develop calendrical systems and scholarly traditions that connect celestial observation with ritual and decision-making. That is broadly accepted. Now the interpretation, gently labeled. One interpretation is that sky knowledge becomes a political resource. Those who manage calendars and interpret signs can claim a special connection to divine order, and that claim can support the legitimacy of leaders and institutions. A more cautious explanation could be that the calendar is both practical and symbolic. It coordinates agriculture and festivals, and it also expresses cosmic order, which rulers want to appear aligned with. Now, the mystery, framed safely. A fringe idea proposes that some ancient star lists encode a much older tradition, perhaps inherited from an earlier culture or lost phase of knowledge, and that later scribes preserve it without fully understanding its origin. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for an unknown advanced predecessor is thin if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. It becomes a gentle reminder that knowledge can be cumulative, and traditions can outlast their original context. People can repeat a pattern because it works, even if they forget why it started. You let the cinematic what-if drift in, soft and sleepy. What if the night sky is the first propaganda poster, pinned above your head? Not in a sinister sense, but in a poetic sense. The sky is the ultimate authority symbol. It is huge. It is consistent. It is beyond human reach. If a ruler can claim alignment with that, it makes the ruler feel inevitable. If a temple can claim it knows the sky's messages, it makes the temple feel essential. You glance toward the temple complex in the distance. Its lamps are small points of light, lower than the stars, but brighter than the houses. You imagine a festival where the timing is announced, where people gather because the calendar says it is time. They might not know the math behind it. They might not know the observational method. They simply trust that someone does. Trust is a kind of currency, and the calendar spends it. Historians still argue whether early festival calendars are standardized across regions or vary widely by city and period, and how early formal astronomical schemes truly become systematic. Those details are debated, and that is okay. The big picture is steady. Timekeeping and sky observation carry authority. You stand and stretch, and your joints make a quiet complaint. You whisper to them, "Yes, yes, I hear you," like you are negotiating with ancient spirits. Except the spirits are your knees. This is what happens when you travel through history in your imagination. You do not get younger. You just get more reflective. You walk to the edge of the roof and look down at a small courtyard where a family sleeps on mats. Their breathing is slow. A lamp glows low. A jar of water sits in the corner. Ordinary life beneath an extraordinary sky. And you realize something that feels like a new clue. The rulers before recorded history might be the ones who first linked the sky to social order in a formal way. They might be the ones who say, "We will mark the months like this," and "We will hold the festival then," and "We will interpret this event as meaningful." A popular rumor claims that certain ancient scholars could predict everything with eerie accuracy, as if they possessed a secret science far beyond their time. This theory isn't widely accepted in that dramatic form. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is possible that careful observation over generations allows practical forecasting of seasons and lunar cycles, and that this ability feels powerful to those who do not see the underlying method. That is not supernatural certainty. It is accumulated skill and social respect. This is suggestive, not conclusive. You watch a thin cloud drift across the stars, and for a moment the sky dims, then clears. The change is gentle, like a slow blink. You think about how uncertainty itself can be part of authority. If the sky is ambiguous, interpreters become necessary. If a sign can mean multiple things, the interpreter's judgment matters more. Ambiguity creates jobs. Even today, ambiguity creates entire industries. You sit again, cross-legged, and let your mind slow. You collect the layered answer, calm and steady. Most historians agree that sky observation and calendars become important in Mesopotamian ritual and governance. One interpretation is that those who controlled timekeeping and omen interpretation can shape decisions and legitimacy, functioning as a hidden layer of rule. And what if, under a roof cooled by night air, the earliest rulers are the ones who teach a city to obey not only a person, but a schedule written in the language of the heavens? The stars keep shining. The city keeps sleeping. The rooftop becomes a quiet bridge between earth and sky, and you let that bridge hold you gently, like a lullaby made of mathematics and starlight. You slip down from the rooftop into a street that feels wider here, as if the city is giving itself room to breathe. The moonlight lays pale stripes across the ground, and the shadows of doorway posts stretch like sleepy arms. Somewhere, a drum taps softly. Not a war drum, more like a ritual beat that someone forgot to stop. It fades, returns, then fades again, like a heart that is dreaming. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian literature includes heroic narratives and epics that blend myth, memory, and ideology. The evidence we do have points to stories that reshape older traditions to serve cultural values. Bravery, kingship, divine favor, and the struggle against chaos. Even when the stories are not historical reports, They reveal how people imagine power. You walk past a wall with a painted or carved scene, worn by time and weather, but still readable in its attitude. A hero stands tall. A creature or enemy figure stands opposite. The image does not need fine detail to communicate the message. Order faces threat, and order expects to win. It is not just art. It is a public mood. A careful reading might suggest that some monsters in these narratives could symbolize real-world rivals. A dragon-like threat might represent an enemy city, a hostile king, or even a dangerous landscape. That is a possibility, not a certainty. But it is a common way stories operate. They dress politics in costumes. They turn conflict into something you can describe around a fire without naming your neighbor directly. Because naming your neighbor directly can start a fight. And you already have enough of those. Historians still argue whether specific epic motifs preserve faint historical memories of conflicts and alliances, or whether they are primarily timeless mythic patterns that can be applied to any era. That debate matters, because if epics contain political echoes, then they might hint at how power worked before formal chronicles became reliable. You enter a courtyard where a group sits in a loose circle, the way people do when the night is long and stories are the only entertainment that does not require a budget. A storyteller's voice is low and rhythmic. The listeners are half relaxed, half alert, because even bedtime stories can carry warnings. The storyteller describes a king who builds, who fights, who negotiates with the divine. The king is larger than ordinary life, but not impossibly distant. He worries about reputation. He wants his city to endure. He wants his name to last. Most historians agree that rulers in Mesopotamian tradition often use building projects and temple patronage to express legitimacy. The evidence we do have points to kings presenting themselves as protectors of order and providers of prosperity. But in the story, the king also needs an enemy. Sometimes the enemy is a beast. Sometimes it is a demon-like figure. Sometimes it is a wilderness that refuses to be tamed. A careful reading might suggest that the enemy is not just entertainment. It is a mirror that makes the king look necessary. If chaos is terrifying, then authority feels comforting. That is not sinister. It is storytelling as social glue. A small joke drifts through your mind as you listen. You think, every era has its marketing. Ancient kings have epics. Modern brands have commercials. And somehow both are trying to convince you that without them the world will collapse into chaos. At least the ancient version has better monsters. Now the mainstream anchor stays steady. Mesopotamian epics and myths exist, and they often center kingship, divine relationships, and the defeat of threats to order. Now the interpretation, gently labeled. One interpretation is that royal stories are propaganda in a broad sense, shaping how people understand leadership. A more cautious explanation could be that these narratives both entertain and educate, teaching communities what a good ruler should look like: brave, pious, protective, and connected to the gods. Now the mystery side, framed safely. A fringe idea proposes that certain epic conflicts might encode very specific political feuds, preserving them in disguised form long after the original names are forgotten. This theory isn't widely accepted in a one-to-one way, because symbolism is slippery. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a gentle way to read the stories, not as secret history, but as a memory cloud that might contain real storms. You notice that the storyteller emphasizes the king's relationship with the city itself. The city is almost a character. Walls matter, gates matter, temples matter. The people listening nod at the right parts, like they are confirming their own identity. This is where the rulers before recorded history can appear as shadows. Even if you cannot verify their names, you can see the kind of leader the culture wants to imagine. You step away from the circle and walk along a street where the walls are decorated with small reliefs. Some show processions, some show offerings, some show the king in a stylized posture that suggests dominance without needing violence. The image says, "Order is standing here." That is the point. Historians still argue whether the heroic ideal in early Mesopotamian tradition reflects actual political behavior or mainly aspirational messaging. Leaders might not always behave like the stories. That is true everywhere. The story is what people wish leadership would be, and also what leaders wish people would believe. You pause at a gate where two guards sit. They are relaxed, spears nearby, posture loose. Their boredom is a lullaby. You listen to their quiet conversation and catch a few words about rations and duties. Even here, the system shows itself. The guards are part of the story of order, but they also live inside the practical world of schedules and supply. Now the question becomes fresh again. What do the tablets hint about rulers before recorded history, when you look through the lens of epic and propaganda? One interpretation is that stories might preserve an older pattern of legitimacy, where rule is justified by defeating chaos, building monuments, and pleasing gods. If so, the earliest rulers might be remembered not by their administrative records, but by the narrative roles assigned to them later. A popular rumor claims that ancient epics are literal records of battles with non-human monsters. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it tends to ignore how metaphor and symbol work in ancient literature. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is possible that stories of monsters reflect fear of natural dangers, enemy groups, or political instability, transformed into vivid imagery. This is suggestive, not conclusive. You walk toward a workshop where a sculptor carves a small figure, perhaps a protective being with a calm, stern face. The sculptor's hands are dusty, and his focus is total. Protective figures in Mesopotamian tradition are often meant to ward off misfortune. The evidence we do have points to a strong desire to keep chaos outside the door. That desire feeds both ritual and storytelling. Now, you let a calm, cinematic what-if settle in. What if every dragon-like threat is just a rival city wearing a scary mask? Not because the storyteller is hiding a coded message for future detectives, but because the imagination naturally exaggerates what it fears. A rival city is dangerous, unpredictable, and full of strangers, so it becomes a monster. When the king defeats it, the audience feels safe. You wander to the edge of a plaza where a stela-like stone stands, worn and hard to read, but still heavy with intention. It exists to be seen. It exists to declare something. Even when the text is unclear, the posture of the object is loud. This matters. Remember this. Most historians agree that rulers across Mesopotamian history use monuments and inscriptions to project authority. The evidence we do have points to public messaging as part of rule. Historians still argue whether the earliest phases of Mesopotamian political culture already include fully developed royal ideology, or whether it grows gradually as cities compete and kingship becomes more formalized. Either way, the stories and images show you what people think leadership should mean. A second small joke arrives, gentle and sleepy. You think, if you were an ancient king, you would absolutely commission an epic about yourself, and you would definitely request fewer flaws and more glowing descriptions. It is basically the original social media profile, except carved in stone and way harder to delete. You return to the storyteller circle, and the story shifts toward resolution. The king triumphs. Order is restored. The city is safe. Everyone exhales. The listeners look satisfied in the quiet way people do when a story reassures them that the world makes sense. Now you hold the layered answer. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian epics and royal narratives shape cultural ideas of kingship and order. One interpretation is that these stories function as propaganda and teaching tools, and that monsters can symbolize threats like rivals or chaos. And what if the hint about rulers before recorded history is not a secret name hidden in a tablet, but a template of power? A recurring storyline that tells you how leadership is imagined when the past is too foggy to confirm. The drumbeat in the distance fades completely. The city grows quieter. You feel your thoughts soften, as if the story has tucked them in. And in the moonlit streets, the rulers of the earliest age remain partly unseen, not because they are supernatural, but because the culture remembers them in the language of symbols. Builder, protector, chosen one, chaos breaker, a role more than a roster, a dream more than a document. You move into a quieter part of the city where the streets narrow again and the buildings look older, patched and slightly uneven, like they have been repaired so many times that the original plan has become a rumor. The air here smells like dust that has been warm for centuries. A small pile of broken pottery sits near a doorway, and you catch yourself staring at it the way people stare at a cracked photo frame, wondering what story used to sit inside. Most historians agree that much of what we know about early Mesopotamia comes from incomplete evidence. Tablets break, walls collapse. Layers get disturbed, and entire archives can vanish through accident, disaster, or simple time. The evidence we do have points to a past that is not neatly preserved but scattered in fragments. That is not a failure of history. It is the normal condition of history. You step into a dim storage room where a few broken tablets lie on a mat. They look like pieces of dried earth, and yet the wedge marks on them are still sharp enough to catch lamplight. A worker sorts them gently, as if the pieces might bite if handled roughly. You watch the hands turn each fragment, trying to find edges that fit. It feels like a quiet puzzle game invented by fate. Archaeology suggests that many texts survive only because they were buried, collapsed into ruins, or accidentally fired by heat in a destruction event, which hardens the clay. That means survival can be random. A boring tablet might survive because it fell behind a wall. A fascinating one might vanish because it stayed in a damp room. The past is not curated for your convenience. The past is messy. Historians still argue whether gaps in the record are mostly caused by preservation chance and later damage, or whether some gaps reflect deliberate choices, such as what scribes decided to copy and keep, or what institutions considered important. Both factors can operate together, even if no one is hiding anything. The act of selection can still shape memory. You walk along a corridor where the plaster has cracked, and you see a faint trace of a painted line, maybe part of a design that once mattered. It is barely there, but your mind wants to complete it. That is what humans do. We fill gaps. We imagine missing parts. And this is where the mystery part of tonight's theme naturally lives, because rulers before recorded history often sit in those gaps. Most historians agree that later texts sometimes attempt to organize the deep past into lists and sequences, but those lists are only as good as the traditions behind them, and those traditions pass through many hands. A careful reading might suggest that copying itself is a kind of editing. A scribe can correct an older spelling. A scribe can harmonize a confusing passage. A scribe can quietly favor the version that fits the political mood of the day. None of this needs to be sinister to be true. It can be as simple as someone thinking, "This makes more sense," and writing it that way. You pause by a shelf where tablets are stacked, some whole, some cracked. The cracks look like little lightning bolts frozen in clay. You think about how a broken tablet can create a missing king. If a line breaks off, a name disappears. If a fragment containing a reign length is lost, the timeline shifts. If an entire tablet is gone, a whole dynasty can become silence. A fringe idea proposes that some missing portions of king lists and traditions might reflect deliberate omission by later regimes that want to simplify the story of legitimacy. This theory isn't widely accepted as a sweeping rule, because evidence of purposeful erasure is hard to prove. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is possible that later political powers promote some narratives and neglect others, and that neglected texts are less likely to be copied and preserved. That is not a secret conspiracy. It is normal human behavior. People preserve what helps them. This is suggestive, not conclusive. You step outside and follow a street to a small courtyard filled with rubble. Someone is clearing it, stacking bricks neatly as if they can rebuild order out of chaos. You watch the process and realize that rebuilding is also rewriting. Every time a city is rebuilt, the old layers are covered. Archives can be moved, lost, or repurposed. A tablet can become fill material in a wall. The past can literally become a brick in the present. Most historians agree that cities in Mesopotamia are often built in layers, with new structures rising atop old ones. Archaeology suggests that tells form this way, accumulating centuries of rebuilding. That means the older you go, the harder it can be to access clean evidence, and the more likely it is that earlier materials are disturbed. Now, the interpretation, gently labeled. One interpretation is that the absence of evidence for certain rulers is not proof they never existed, but evidence of how fragile records are. A more cautious explanation could be that early leadership might not always take forms that produce durable inscriptions. If power is shared, temporary, or expressed through institutions rather than a single monarch, it leaves fewer clear royal signatures. You walk into a small scribal school space where an apprentice practices signs on a clay tablet. The apprentice's posture is tense, like someone trying not to disappoint a teacher who believes perfection is a moral duty. The signs are uneven, and you can almost hear the teacher's sigh. The apprentice glances up at you like, "Do not judge me. I am inventing my resume." A small joke slips in. You think, imagine being graded on wedge marks and having your teacher say, "This triangle is emotionally unstable." Ancient schooling feels intense. You watch the teacher smooth the apprentice's tablet and have him try again. The act of smoothing is an act of erasing, and that is a perfect metaphor for how history gets shaped. Some mistakes are erased. Some versions are smoothed. Some roughness disappears. The result is cleaner, but it might also be less honest. Historians still argue whether scribal training and standardization reduce variation in texts over time, creating a more unified tradition, or whether local schools maintain distinctive styles and content. That debate matters because it affects how you read the deep past. If texts are standardized, then a single narrative can spread widely. If texts are local, then multiple competing narratives might exist, and only some survive. Now you let the cinematic what if drift in, calm and careful. What if the missing pieces are missing on purpose? Not in a dramatic secret society way, but in the ordinary way that someone chooses what to copy, what to teach, what to store, and what to ignore. In that sense, the deep past is shaped not only by floods and fires, but by boredom, bias, and limited shelf space. A popular rumor claims that somewhere there is a hidden cache of tablets that would rewrite everything about early rulers if it were found. This theory isn't widely accepted in the dramatic sense, because discoveries tend to add nuance more than flip the entire story overnight. But it is true that new finds can change details and fill gaps. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is possible that unknown archives remain buried, and that future discoveries could clarify names, sequences, and social structures. That is a possibility, not a certainty. You sit on a low wall in the courtyard and listen to the quiet. The city feels asleep, and the rubble feels like a reminder that everything is temporary. You think about the emotional effect of gaps. When you do not know, you imagine. When you imagine, you create rulers who fit your expectations. That is why it is important to keep the truth ladder clear. The documented ground is fragments and partial lists. The interpreted layer is how scholars reconstruct sequences from what survives. The imagined layer is the cinematic mist where you picture lost dynasties and hidden names. Most historians agree that the early record includes discontinuities, and that reconstruction involves careful comparison of texts, archaeology, and later compilations. One interpretation is that later scribes sometimes reshape the past to make political legitimacy feel smoother. Another interpretation is that gaps reflect simple loss. Both can happen. Historians still argue whether the overall shape of early Mesopotamian political development is best described as a steady evolution toward kingship, or as a series of shifts and experiments where leadership forms change, merge, and reappear. That is a soothing thought in its own way, because it means the past is not a straight line. It is a river with branches. You stand and brush dust from your hands. And you smile softly because dust is the one thing that never stops showing up in every century, on every story. You take a slow breath and gather the answer for tonight's theme. Most historians agree that broken tablets, missing archives, and layered rebuilding create major gaps in what we can know about early rulers. One interpretation is that those gaps allow later traditions to smooth, simplify, and sometimes reshape legitimacy narratives. And what if the real hint is not a single hidden king, but the quiet truth that history is stitched from what survives, and what survives is shaped by chance and choice? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. The courtyard grows still. The rubble becomes a soft landscape in moonlight, and you let the missing pieces remain missing, not as a frustration, but as part of the bedtime feeling. Some questions are allowed to stay gentle and open, like a door left slightly ajar so the night air can drift through. Word count, 1,608. Awaiting 1. Banjanoi. Mot, do not use. Do not duplicate content. Each part is a new development to help listeners not get bored. Do not reference to before. After section, do not linked source, Thenthoai story. Hegyo. Janoi. Section Moi. You walk to a quiet stretch of riverbank where the city lights are fewer and the night feels wider. The ground is cool under your feet, and the river moves in a slow, steady hush that sounds like someone turning pages in the dark. A few reeds sway gently, and their soft rustle blends with insect song, making a natural kind of white noise that feels almost designed for sleep. Most historians agree that the dawn of Sumerian writing sits in a zone where myth and record overlap, and that later compilations and stories try to give the deep past a shape that feels orderly. The evidence we do have points to real cities, real institutions, and real administrative systems, alongside narrative traditions that stretch time, elevate origins, and frame kingship as a sacred inheritance. That blend is not a flaw. It is a feature of how humans remember. You kneel by the water and let it slip through your fingers. It is cold, and it grounds you, because when you talk about rulers before recorded history, the temptation is to float away into pure fantasy, chasing a single hidden answer. But the calmer approach is to hold 3 layers at once. Documented, the tablets of rations, labor, seals, and the visible growth of cities. Interpreted, the way lists and myths might reflect social structures, legitimacy claims, and symbolic time. Imagined, the cinematic fog where you let the earliest rulers become silhouettes, not because you are claiming they are literal, but because the mind likes a picture. Historians still argue whether the earliest idea of kingship in southern Mesopotamia is best understood as emerging from temple administration, from warfare and diplomacy, or from a shifting mix that changes by city and season. That debate is not a dead end. It is a reminder that power can be practical and sacred at the same time. In a riverland, leadership can mean controlling water, organizing labor, setting ritual schedules, and persuading people that the system is aligned with cosmic order. You sit on a flat stone and listen to the river. In the distance, a sleepy animal makes a small sound, then goes quiet. The city is behind you, but you do not need to see it to feel it. You can sense the layers of human activity: storehouses, temples, workshops, rooftops under stars, and story circles around low flames. Those layers create a pattern, and that pattern is, in a way, the best hint the tablets offer. Most historians agree that later texts, like king lists and mythic traditions, serve social and political purposes, as well as preserving memory. One interpretation is that the rulers before history are partly a symbolic device, designed to make kingship feel ancient, inevitable, and divinely sanctioned. A more cautious explanation could be that some names and sequences preserve distorted memories of real local leaders. But the further back you go, the more the story becomes a cultural mirror rather than a photograph. That's a possibility, not a certainty. A fringe idea proposes that the deep past may include forgotten phases of leadership or settlement that are poorly visible today due to preservation limits, shifting river courses, and the randomness of survival. This theory isn't widely accepted in its more dramatic forms, and the evidence is often thin. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes something gentle, an acknowledgement that the river plain changes, that cities rebuild, and that archives can vanish. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You look up at the stars and let your eyes relax. The sky feels patient. You think about how timekeeping and omen interpretation can shape authority, how epics can paint rulers as protectors against chaos, how administrative records can hide hierarchy in plain sight, and how missing fragments can leave gaps that imagination tries to fill. You do not have to pick one single explanation and force it to be the only truth. In fact, that would be the least ancient thing you could do. Ancient thinking is often layered. A popular rumor claims that somewhere in the deep archive of the world, there is a single tablet that explains everything about the earliest rulers, like a perfect final page that ties every thread into one neat knot. This theory isn't widely accepted, and honestly, it sounds like the kind of thing your brain invents because it loves closure. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is possible that new discoveries can clarify parts of the picture, but it is also likely that the earliest era will always retain some fog, because human life outruns record-keeping, and because record-keeping begins unevenly. This is suggestive, not conclusive. You smile softly at yourself, because the desire for a final answer is universal. It is the same desire that makes you check the fridge even though you already know what is inside. You open it anyway, hoping a snack has magically appeared. Ancient kingship research is basically that, except the fridge is buried under 5,000 years of rebuilding. Now, you gather the calm conclusion in your hands like a warm cup. Most historians agree that Sumerian tablets give us a clear view of administration, economy, and early institutions, and a less direct view of named rulers in the deepest layers of time. One interpretation is that the idea of prehistory rulers is a blend of symbolic storytelling and political legitimacy, using impossible reigns and sacred framing to emphasize the distance of origins. Another interpretation is that the earliest rulers may be found not as dramatic kings, but as systems, the people and institutions who control water, labor, storage, calendars, and ritual authority. What if the rulers before recorded history are not a single hidden dynasty, but a patchwork of real leadership roles remembered through the tools that survived? You let the river's sound slow your thoughts. And now comes the wind down, the part where your mind gets permission to stop chasing and start floating. You stay seated by the riverbank, and the night grows softer around you. The reeds sway a little, then settle. The stars seem steady, like they have been steady through every human argument about what really happened. You breathe in, slowly, and you imagine the clay tablets stacked in dark rooms, resting, unbothered, as if they know they do not need to explain themselves to anyone. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. And tonight, you can let all three coexist without conflict. You can let the documented parts be solid, like the cool stone under your hand. You can let interpretation be a quiet lantern, illuminating possibilities without claiming certainty. You can let imagination be a thin mist over the water, pretty and harmless, there to soothe rather than to deceive. You listen to the river again and notice how consistent it is. It does not rush. It does not argue. It just moves. You let your thoughts move like that too, drifting past temple lights, past lists of kings, past stories of floods and sages, past the hush of storehouses and the silent authority of calendars. No need to solve. No need to prove. You're not proving anything tonight. You are following clues, and now you are letting the clues rest. Your eyelids grow heavier, and the world narrows to simple sensations. Cool air, soft sounds, the steady rhythm of water. The rulers in the far mist become only shapes, not demands. The city behind you becomes only warmth, not noise, and you feel a calm certainty about one thing that does not need debate. Human beings have always tried to remember their beginnings, and the act of remembering is itself a kind of tenderness. You take one last slow breath, and you let the river carry the remaining questions downstream, gently, quietly, until they dissolve into the night. End of script. Sweet dreams.